Hi everyone and welcome to part 3 of this lecture on other possibilities for qualitative data generation with me, Victoria Clark. In this final part we're going to focus on the methods of story completion and vignettes. These 3 lectures are relatively self-contained, so you don't necessarily have to have listened to part 1 and part 2 before you listen to this part 3. This lecture is part of a collaboration between Virginia Brown on the left, Nikki Hayfield on the right, and me, Victoria Clark, in the middle, creating online resources for teaching and learning about qualitative methods. So if you've already listened to part 2 on qualitative surveys, this final part will have a similar format. We're going to look at what story completion tasks and vignettes are, when and why you might want to use them, how to go about designing them. We'll give you some examples of story completion and vignette studies, and then we'll evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of story-based methods. So story completion is for me a really fun technique where as a researcher you create the start of a story based on a hypothetical scenario. So you invent characters and the opening sentences of a story or the sentence of a story, and you ask participants to complete the story, to respond to it by writing a fictional story. So it's a technique that has a long history. It started out as a projective technique. So if you're familiar with the Rorschach ink blot test, that is an example of a projective technique where you give people an ambiguous stimuli and then they have to draw on their unconscious motivations and so on to kind of make sense of the stimulus. And so projectives were seen by psychoanalytic practitioners as a way to the kind of unconscious, a way to kind of unearth unconscious thoughts and feelings. Story completion was used specifically with children as an assessment tool, and it didn't really crop up as a research technique beyond child development research until the 1970s, when it was used by a feminist psychologist called Martina Horner, based in the US, to explore fear of success. And she argued that on the basis of her use of story completion, which she interpreted in a broadly kind of psychoanalytic way, that women had a fear of success, and that's why they weren't successful, because success was incompatible with femininity. You can imagine that those findings were not very popular with people. There were lots of critiques, lots of responses, lots of research showing that what she found wasn't true, and this rather did for the method. It was associated with these rather problematic findings and interpretations, and so it wasn't really used until the 1990s, when my PhD supervisor Celia Kitzinger, with an undergraduate student, decided to let's rework this method, let's recoup it and reclaim it. So their argument was that story completion didn't have to be used to access kind of the essential psychological truths of people. It could be used to explore people's perceptions, how they make sense of things, and they used it that way in a study on perceptions of infidelity in straight relationships. It's a method I was intrigued by, several other of Celia's PhD students were intrigued by, and so we formed the Story Completion Research Group probably about a decade ago now, and we started exploring the method and giving presentations on the method, and we published a special issue of the journal Qualitative Research in Psychology in 2019, and that has seemed to have had an impact, and we're seeing more and more kind of story completion research published all the time, which is great. And then vignettes is a method also with a long history, tended to be used in quantitative research, where rather than asking people to write a story, you give them a story, a scenario, and then you ask them to respond to questions about that scenario. And it can be one scenario and one set of questions, or it can be what's called a stepped or a staged vignette, where you give people the start of the scenario, you ask them questions about that, then the story develops and you ask them some questions about that, and then the story develops further and you ask them some questions about that. And both of these techniques can be used in combination with other methods, or they can be used as standalone techniques. So these methods are both great for exploring people's perceptions and social constructions of particular topics. They can be used, they are used to explore first person lived experience and first person essential psychological truths and so on, but it's complex because you're having to make the interpretive leap that what people are saying in response to a hypothetical scenario kind of reflects their lived experience, but it is done. They're useful because they can get around barriers of social desirability, because people are writing a story or responding to a story, and particularly when it's a third person vignette or they're writing a third person story completion, they're not sort of accountable for their views. They're dealing with fiction, and so that can mean that people feel less kind of pressure to say socially desirable things. They can also be great to explore sensitive topics, and ethically they can kind of open up topics that you might not be able to explore in terms of lived experience. And they're also great for things like kind of moral dilemmas. So how would people deal with, or how should people deal with a particular situation? And story completion is an example of a creative technique because it's about story writing, getting participants to write you a story rather than kind of self-report. And they're also, in terms of qualitative research, they're relatively novel, relatively kind of innovative techniques. They're both being kind of taken up and used more and more, but they're really exciting because they're not the kind of standard interview plus TA and IPA approach. So they are seen as offering something a bit different. So now I'd like to invite you to pause the recording and reflect on a topic that's relevant to either counselling psychology or music therapy that you could explore using a story-based method, so either story completion or vignettes. Sometimes people use a combination of the two, so they might start participants off with a vignette. So here's the start of the scenario, answer some questions about it, and then they get them to complete the story, so what they think kind of happens next. So you might want to think about that hybrid possibility as well. So if you'd like to pause the recording to reflect on this, please do so now. So what do you need to think about when designing story-based methods like story completion and vignettes? Obviously the story, the scenario needs to be easily understood by participants, and it needs to be meaningful for them. It needs to resonate, it needs to feel kind of authentic, and it needs to engage them. You obviously want to use clear language and appropriate language unless you're intending to introduce an element of ambiguity. So story stems have often had the kind of ambiguity that's associated with projective techniques in the past in order to explore people's kind of assumptions. So you might use a gender neutral name for a character to explore how participants gender that character if they do, and what this kind of tells you about the topic and so on. You also need to think about the length and the level of detail that you want to go into. So some story stems, for example, are very short, some, because they need to convey quite a bit of information to participants so they understand what it is they need to write about, tend to be a bit longer. So it's thinking about what do the participants need to know in order to make sense of this scenario and provide me with meaningful data. You need to think about what questions you're trying to address or what assumptions you're trying to uncover by using designed in ambiguity in the stem or the vignette scenario. So what is it that you're trying to get at? You also need to think about whether you want participants to kind of empathize with or take the point of view of a particular character. And it might be that there is just one character, and so that's very straightforward. But if there are several characters in the stem or the scenario, what character do you want people to kind of empathize with? You might not. You might want to kind of leave it open so they can decide whose point of view that they're taking. And story stems in particular, they need a narrative hook. They need kind of a bit of tension. They need, like the EastEnders, duff, duff, duff at the end to kind of draw people in and engage them to write a story. You don't want something that's incredibly predictable, where there's probably one way that things can kind of pan out. You want it to be kind of juicy and have lots of kind of narrative possibility to give people the freedom to kind of take the story in whatever direction they want. Obviously, you might want them to cover particular things, in which case you'd give instructions specifying, you know, please write a story that addresses blah, blah, blah. But in general, you want a story that there's that kind of narrative tension there that kind of entices people in. Thinking about design for story completion specifically, You can use one stem or you can use multiple stems. So if your research has a comparative element, as I'll mention in a moment, you might have multiple stems. So you're looking at comparing perceptions of different things, or there might be, you want to use kind of different stems and different scenarios because you want to look at kind of sense making across scenarios. So with some colleagues, I did a story completion study looking at how people made sense of lockdown breaches, kind of breaking the rules around lockdown in the UK and New Zealand. And because we didn't want to get people's perspectives on a particular scenario, but on the idea of kind of lockdown breaches more generally, we used, I think, about 6 different scenarios that reflected kind of stories that had been covered in the media in order to look more broadly at how people made sense of kind of rule breaching. You need to think about first or third person completion. So do you want to instruct participants to imagine themselves in the role of the character? And this has been used in several story completion studies. Or do you want to, as is more common, get people to continue writing a third person story? So you present them with a stem about, I don't know, Jim and Angela, and you want to continue writing a third person story about Jim and Angela. You also need to think about how you're making sense of the data. I'll just touch on this briefly here, but if you're interested in story completion, this is definitely something to do some reading around. So how are you thinking about what the data gives you access to? Do you think the data gives you access to essential psychological truths? So you're kind of making that interpretive leap that what people write in response to this fictional stem tells you about something that's going on inside their heads? Or do you think of the data as giving you access to kind of social perceptions of how people kind of make sense of things and how their views are kind of embedded in particular social contexts? Or do you see the data as giving you access to kind of social constructions? So social perceptions, social constructions can be seen as kind of slightly different versions of the same thing, in the sense that you're interested in how people make sense of things, but those might be individual views embedded in a social context, or they might be social constructions. So in terms of comparative design, what people have done in the literature to date is they've compared responses to variations in the stem. So they've compared responses to a male character versus a female character. So the scenario is exactly the same. So it might be an infidelity scenario. So if we go back to the Kitzinger and Powell study, so it's someone suspects their partner's cheating, and that someone could be a man or a woman. So you look at differences in perceptions to when it's a man cheating versus a woman cheating, and so on. Other examples include comparing responses to anorexia versus bulimia, children versus adults. So one study that's been conducted relatively recently looked at perceptions of a family member coming out as trans, and the authors compared perceptions of a children or an adolescent coming out versus an adult coming out. You might look at perceptions of class, and there's a great health study that looks at perceptions of pain in relation to working class and middle class women. And you might look at perceptions of emotional versus sexual infidelity. So there's lots of possibilities for comparative designs and comparing how people perceive things where there's a variation in the stem. So stems are typically otherwise identical apart from the thing that's being varied that you're kind of interested in. And there's also a history of comparing the responses of different participant groups. So for the most part, these have been gender-based comparisons, so comparing the responses of men versus women. But there's also some interesting research comparing the responses of therapists versus non-therapists. So there's lots of possibilities for comparative design in story completion, which is quite unusual in qualitative methods. Qualitative methods doesn't really provide a framework for comparative design, but because you're giving people something that's identical and you're doing it within a very particular framework, this is a possibility with story completion. So for vignettes, there are some other considerations. So again, you'll want to think about, are you having one scenario or several? So are you having a stepped scenario, or you might use 2 different scenarios and get people to respond to both of those. Do you want people to respond in the first person? So what would you do in this situation versus the third person? So third First person can take you closer to people's experiences and their own views. Third person has the advantage of kind of distance and so on. In what direction you'll kind of take the scenario. So if you're going to have a step scenario and the story is going to evolve, how will it evolve? Where will it go? And the kinds of questions. So are you going to ask people about what the characters would do, what they should do, what they could do? And it's worth kind of reflecting on the differences here. So could captures the range of possibilities, should captures kind of something moral and an ideal perhaps, and would captures what's kind of realistic. So it's some things to think about there in terms of designing vignette studies. So some other design considerations include how you deliver the study. And again, typically studies are delivered online, but there's also possibilities for email if that's a good fit for your participant group, although some GDPR considerations there, and also hard copy. So for example, I've done hard copy story completions with students, sixth formers visiting kind of UE for a taster day, and they participated in some studies, obviously with consent and permission, and we handed out the hard copy stories for them to complete in the moment. So there might be some situations where hard copy completion makes sense. In terms of the stem or the vignette, it can be written, but there's also some interesting examples of people having video stems or spoken vignettes, so it doesn't necessarily have to be something written. And again, with completion, written is typical, but there are also studies where people have asked people to kind of speak their story, or there's interesting research with children where they kind of act out the story with dolls but also narrate it. And also in more recent research there's examples of group completion. So typically most research is about one participant completing a story or one participant completing a vignette, but in more recent research there are examples of people kind of working together to tell a story or working together to respond to a vignette. Instructions for completion need to be really clear and appropriate for the participant group, and with methods like this you really need to pilot. This sort of unexpected, unanticipated can happen an awful lot with both story completion and vignettes, so piloting is really important to make sure that people are giving you data that's interesting and that will enable you to kind of address your research questions. So it's really important to pilot. So I just want to flag up some resources. So we discuss story completion in our book Successful Qualitative Research. That's me and Jenny Brown. And if you go on the companion website, there's also a discussion of vignettes, and there's lots of examples of research materials on story completion and vignettes. There's also some example of data generated through these methods to give you a sense of what story completion and vignette data can look like. Okay, so let's look at an example story completion study by Naomi Moller and Irmgard Tischner, exploring young people's perceptions of fat therapists. And they were using story completion because they were interested in exploring the perceptions and intersections of professional competence, gender and fatness. So they used a STEM featuring a female therapist, and they felt story completion was the appropriate technique because it's a sensitive technique. There's lots of social desirability norms as well as very negative views and stigma, and they didn't want participants to feel that they had to take ownership of their views. They were interested in dominant social understandings available to young people in relation to fatness in the context of counselling, so the research kind of falls into the social perceptions framework that most contemporary story completion research does. And the participants were 203 young people who were attending or visiting the university that the authors were based at, and there was 2 rounds of data collection. So the first one was hard copy, and then the second one was online using Qualtrics. So it was a single STEM design using third person completion. Kate has been finding it really difficult to cope with life, so she has decided to go for counselling. As she walks into the counselling room for the first time, her first thought is, "Oh, my counsellor is fat." So we've got that expression of surprise that gives the narrative hook for the story. In terms of completion instructions, participants were told to read the opening lines of the story and write what happens next. And in the participant information sheet, they were told that there's no right or wrong way to complete the story, and you can be as creative as you like in completing the story. We're interested in the range of different stories that people tell, and these are lifted from my and Ginny Brown's story completion instructions for our book Successful Qualitative Research. And because we've made these publicly available, lots of people have tended to use these instructions for recent story completion research. So no real restrictions, loose and open. People aren't directed to a particular time frame. They aren't asked to write about particular things, which are all possibilities with story completion. Instead, it's a very kind of general what happens next instruction. So the data were analysed using thematic analysis, and it was organised around 3 themes. So firstly, the idea that fat is distracting and distancing in the therapeutic relationships. So perceptions of fatness were overwhelmingly negative and were seen as something that ruptured the therapeutic relationship. And also fat therapists, fat counsellors were seen as not being able to help, that they were rendered kind of incompetent because of their fatness. And also that their mental health was seen as suspicious, because fatness is seen as a signifier of kind of psychological ill health, so they couldn't possibly be competent, they couldn't possibly help because of their fatness. And there are some nice examples in the paper of the data. So the counsellor attempts to give Kate advice, but she's very distracted by the size of her counsellor. Kate is no longer paying attention. So this idea of fatness kind of overwhelming the client. Kate eyed the woman as if this couldn't be happening. How could someone who literally feels herself help anyone with their problems? So this is a very vivid illustration of the idea of fatness rendering people kind of incompetent and also psychologically unwell, and so not able to kind of help people. So this study certainly got beyond kind of social desirability barriers. The data reflected some very negative perceptions of fatness. So here are some other examples of story completion studies in relation to mental health and therapy. So we have one on gender variance that I mentioned earlier, one exploring therapists and non-therapist constructions of heterosexual sex, and then a discursive study, so illustrating a social constructionist approach looking at constructions of eating disorders. I've also put here the Kitzinger and Powell study that I mentioned earlier, the study that sort of reclaimed story completion as a qualitative method. It's not online in the library, but it is on Blackboard if you'd be interested in reading this study. And now we have an example of a vignette study. This one was focused on eating disorders and specifically teenage anorexics in inverted commas, conducted by a student researcher, Bronwyn Royal, who was supervised by Helen Mousen. Bronwyn used vignettes because it was a really ethically sensitive topic. It wouldn't be something that she could explore in other ways. She certainly couldn't conduct interviews with people with anorexia as a student, an undergraduate student. And vignettes were really useful because people didn't have to have personal experience of anorexia, so they could focus on kind of wider lay public understandings, that the vignette could direct participants to focus on a particular group. So Bronwyn was interested in perceptions of teenagers with anorexia, and they could also use a comparative design and explore kind of gender. So there were 2 versions of the vignette. A teenage girl with anorexia and then a teenage boy with anorexia, so they could explore how kind of gender intersects with perceptions of anorexia. 57 participants completed the study, and it was an online delivery using Qualtrics. And here's the vignette scenario, and it was a 3rd person completion. So participants weren't advised to put themselves in the role of the character. They were advised to respond in the 3rd person. So I won't read this out. So if you'd like to read out the vignette, and you'll notice it's more detailed than the story stem earlier, and that's often the case for vignettes, that they tend to provide participants with a bit more detail. Please pause the recording now and have a read of the vignette scenario. And then these are the questions that the participants were asked to answer, and they were instructed to answer the following questions, providing as much detail as possible, so encouraging people to provide depth and detail in their responses. And I won't read through all the questions. You can pause the recording and have a read through, but you can even just from a skim, you can get a sense of the questions are inviting to participants to discuss how they're imagining the character of Hannah, what they think they'll look like, and so on, her reasons for becoming preoccupied with her weight and changing her eating habits, and so on. So if you'd like to pause the recording and read through the questions in a bit more detail, please do so now. So questions 6 to 10 focused on other people's perceptions of Hannah, and then what might help Hannah, and then what will happen to Hannah in the future. So if you'd like to read through the questions in a bit more detail, please pause the recording now. Some of the responses to the vignette provide really nice examples of how vignettes are successful, and similarly story completion too, at getting at data that aren't hindered by social desirability. So here's a nice example of one of the responses. I imagine Hannah to be a typical self-absorbed teenager. She probably feels egocentric, that all eyes are on her. She's probably an avid watcher of music channels. Celebrity get me out of here, and the only way is Essex. So a very kind of, or framed as negative kind of perception of Hannah. So this is a really nice illustration of how these methods can move beyond barriers of social desirability. So here are some other examples of vignette studies, all linked to you in the library or in open access repositories if you want to read some more examples of vignette studies. So one focused on risk factors relating to early adolescent pregnancy in Ghana, one about therapist responses to client experiences of discrimination, and one exploring how clinical psychologists respond to child safeguarding dilemmas. So let's think about some of the strengths of story-based methods. Really useful when you want to explore perceptions and views and opinions. Less suited to experience, or perhaps we can say more complex when it comes to experience. They certainly are used to explore lived experience, but they're more complex because we have to make more kind of interpretive leaps about the gap between the data, the story, or the response to the story, and what people are thinking and feeling. Like qualitative surveys, they can be useful for generating lots of data from lots of participants very quickly, particularly when they're delivered online. They avoid some of the ethical issues associated with face-to-face methods of data generation, and also associated with self-report data generation. So when you're asking people to tell you about their experiences, their views and their perspectives and so on, asking people to write stories or respond to a hypothetical vignette can open up a whole range of possibilities that might be kind of excluded ethically. And I've certainly had students use them in that way because they were interested in a topic that they'd never get ethical approval to look at in terms of lived experience because it's incredibly sensitive or relates to behaviour that might be illegal, but it has been possible for them to use story completion or vignettes to explore these topics. As mentioned, they can be really useful for comparative designs, not generally something you can do in qualitative research. And they can be seen as an indirect way of accessing people's views and perspectives, avoiding kind of social demands and social desirability. They're also really useful for getting at assumptions and kind of taken for granted kind of meanings, particularly if you kind of leave bits of the vignette or the story stem vague to get at what people are kind of assuming about something. And as mentioned, really useful for sensitive and ethically and morally complex topics. And I also really like them because they're fun and they're creative. There's creativity in the STEM, but you're also asking for creativity from participants as well. And the data can also be really unexpected, particularly with story completion. You never know what you're going to get. And so that's a really kind of exciting aspect of the method, that it's really unpredictable and fun. So let's finish by thinking about some of the weaknesses or complexities of story-based methods. Firstly, as I've already mentioned, the data are less predictable, so it can be harder to think about how to analyse them. But this can also be really exciting, and it's one of the things about story completion in particular that I really like is I don't know what I'm going to get. I can't imagine what I'm going to get. I can't imagine what story I'm going to tell in the analysis. There's also can be a really wide variation in stories. So in story completion, this can mean fantastical stories about mythical beasts and so on. and what's known as in the kind of traditional kind of psychometric testing literature, participants refusing the task. So they don't write in a storied format, they treat it as if it's a question and answer it as if it's a question, and so on. But all these different kinds of interesting stories can tell you something about the topic. They don't always, they're not always useful, meaningful data, but sometimes they can tell you interesting things about the stories, about the topic. And one thing that I found more recently is genres like fan fiction have taken off. If you get someone who's a fan fiction writer, you can get really long, really interesting stories because people are used to telling stories and writing stories. Data can be less transparent, it can be harder to analyze. The thing that people often struggle with is keeping in mind that what you've got are people's perceptions, that you haven't necessarily got lived experience unless you're theorizing the data is giving you access to that. And so it can be hard to think about, well, how do I frame what I've got? How do I contextualize my study in the introduction, because what I'm focusing on are perceptions and not the actual thing itself. And you often have to do quite a bit of work to think about, well, how am I going to structure and present the analysis? What's my framework going to be for how I present the analysis? I've already mentioned this idea of the gap between the story and reality. In qualitative research, generally, we're focused on the meanings people draw on in writing or responding to stories. But if you're working within an essentialist framework, and if you want to theorize the stories as kind of giving you access to people's experience, then this gap is more of a worry, is more of a concern, and you've got to do more theoretical work to make the argument that these hypothetical scenarios can actually tell you something meaningful about people's lived experience. And then related to this is the concern of the artificiality of the technique. But again, this is very much within a framework of wanting to use the method to kind of access people's lived experience and their essential psychological truths. If you're not doing that, then these are less of a concern because you're treating the data as giving you access to kind of fragments of kind of social perceptions or social constructions rather than people's kind of experiential truths. So we have some references and resources for you. The first is the Story Completion Research Group that I mentioned earlier. Our website, lots of information on there about story completion. There's a talk on story completion on YouTube with me, Nikki Hayfield and Naomi Moller. And there's also a talk on YouTube on vignettes by Deborah Gray and Helen Mawson, both at the same event, a similar event that the talk by Ginny Brown on qualitative surveys was part of. We talk about, as I've already mentioned, story completion in our book Successful Qualitative Research, and on the companion website there's information about vignettes. We've written various bits and pieces about story completion as a story completion research group. This piece you might be interested in is what's known as a spoken word piece. So we all got together and had a discussion. The paper is a kind of edited transcript of that discussion where we're talking about some of the possibilities of story completion, but also some of the challenges. So slide 2 of references and resources. Naomi and I and various others have written a couple of papers on story completion in the context of counselling and psychotherapy research. So here's a recent paper that we've written. I mentioned earlier that the Story Completion Research Group had put together a special issue of the journal Qualitative Research in Psychology. This is our editorial introduction. And we've also written a chapter about story completion methods that's in the book Collecting Qualitative Data. So slide 3 of references and resources. So also in Collecting Qualitative Data, a chapter by Bronwyn Royal, Deborah Gray and Helen Mawson about the vignette technique. So if you want to read more about Bronwyn's study, this is where to go for that. It's the Moller and Tishner paper on fat counsellors, fat therapists, and so you can read their analysis. And then the other paper that Naomi and I and various other people have written about the use of story completion in counselling psychology research.